because Jeremy Corbyn had been in the Palestine solidarity movement for so many years, he had already been attacked in this kind of way. So what I argue in the book, and I think is correct, is that unlike, again, someone like George Galloway or Ken Livingstone, who, they did have national profiles in terms of the mainstream media, Jeremy Corbyn didn't have that so much before he ran for the leadership of the Labour Party. He had to get the members' votes. And so at first, in the first few months, a lot of the mainstream journalists didn't really know who he was.
Mm-hmm.
Like they didn't have their attack lines ready. But the people who did know who he was the Israel lobbyists.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. After Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the British Labour Party, a civil war erupted. Or more accurately, the right wing of the party joined with the Israel lobby and the Israeli state to bring down Corbyn and purge the party of leftists using false accusations of anti-Semitism. The witch hunt continued even after Corbyn's downfall. No reporter has covered the weaponization of anti-Semitism in British politics as rigorously as Asa Winstanley, associate editor at the Electronic Intifada and author of the new book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn, published by OR Books. He joined me to discuss his new book and what the left in other parts of the world can learn from it all. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Asa, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you again, Rania.
Well, it's good to have you on. I'm so excited that your book finally came out. It's such a great book. Obviously, I mentioned it in the intro, but I will mention it again. It's called Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn, and people can go buy it now. And we'll include a link to it in the description. And I think this is such an important book because it's important for historical purposes to know what led to the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn. There's still so much denial about it in the mainstream. And you really, you were very meticulously documenting this in your articles for the Electronic Intifada for the several years that this was taking place since Jeremy Corbyn came to take over the Labour Party. So we're going to get into all the specifics of what really is it's kind of like a movie. It's almost like a thriller in a really horrible, disgusting way. But I think that's something that's kind of important here, just to give people who maybe aren't familiar with your work or maybe know who you are but aren't familiar with your background, because you do have an interesting background. Let's talk about that for a moment, because you actually have been covering the issue of the UK Palestine solidarity movement for over a decade. And you've been following this story. You've also obviously been covering the issue of Palestine for a very long time. So I'm just curious, what got you into the issue of Palestine? What led you to be reporting on these issues in the UK specifically? And then, why did you jump into and cover the Jeremy Corbyn saga as it was taking place?
Yeah, great questions. Well, I think like a lot of people my generation, I joined the anti-war movement in the early noughties. The war against Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, I was opposed to that, and the invasion of Iraq, I was opposed to that. And I was just a normal sort of demonstrator, and I got involved that way. And this does relate to the topic of the book in an indirect way, because at that time, of course, the Labour Party was led by Tony Blair, who, famously backed George Bush's invasion of Iraq and really played a key part in the destruction of Iraq. And, I would argue, and it's been argued before, that then led to the foundation of ISIS indirectly, or, maybe not so indirectly. But nonetheless, at that time, on the anti-war marches and movements, one thing you would always see would be Palestinian flags. And actually, the march in London the February 2003 march, which was massive. It was more than 1 million people in London alone. It was absolutely huge. I was there, and it was really memorable. One thing you would see would be Palestinian flags throughout that whole movement, and actually the co-slogan of the demonstrations in London, at least, was "Don't attack Iraq, freedom for the Palestinians." And of course, this was when the second Intifada was happening, and it was just, I was a lot younger then. I was in my early 20s, and you would always sort of hear about Palestine in the news on a kind of low level,
Right.
and it was always kind of confusing. And I began becoming more interested in why this was, to use the sort of cliche phrase, an intractable conflict, as it's all sort of presented.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, and then I started going to lectures and activist groups and so on and so forth. I started learning more about it, and learning that it wasn't this kind of conflict that was sort of between two sides, and that the history of the military occupation of Palestine, the history of the British occupation of Palestine, the history of Zionism, and all this kinds of stuff. And I got involved in a group called the International Solidarity Movement, which sent delegations of small activist groups to Palestine. It was Rachel Corrie's group, Tom Herndl's group.
Mm.
And I got involved that way. I just found myself getting more involved in the media side of things, and editing human rights reports and putting out press releases to the press corps in Jerusalem that nobody wanted to read or to do anything with ever, because the mainstream press corps was sort of busy, kicking its heels in Jerusalem a lot of the time. So, I got involved in the issue that way, and that gave me my start in journalism, essentially. And I always saw myself as a journalist with views, and a journalist who wasn't afraid to take sides, and I do that, while at the same time being rigorous and factual. So that's how I got into the issue of Palestine, how I began reporting about Palestine. And once I spent a couple of years living in the West Bank, on and off.
Right.
And after I got back to London, I began, reporting more on, rather than things on the ground in Palestine, issues to do with Palestine in the UK, which quite often involves the Israel lobby. And that was not a battle of my choosing. It was thrust on me because anyone who gets involved in the Palestine solidarity movement will be attacked by this powerful lobby in some way.
Right. As we've all experienced, and actually, I mean, they came for you quite heavily the last few years, and we can get to that as well. But I mean, that kind of brings us to the issue of Jeremy Corbyn, right? Because a lot of what you just described of your sort of political trajectory, I mean, you knew who Jeremy Corbyn was because you were involved in these movements. He was involved in these movements even long before, right? Longtime trade unionist, or involved in trade unions, as well as pretty explicitly like anti-imperialist, very pro-Palestine, very anti-war. So let's start with that side of things, because I think for a lot of people outside of the US, and maybe for some people inside the UK who were involved in like left movement politics, we weren't aware of Jeremy Corbyn until he became the leader of the Labour Party back in 2015, I think it was. And so there was, and at the time, I think, there was this really big level of excitement, especially on the left in the global north, because we also had at this point, like the start of the rise of Bernie Sanders. And it seemed like there was maybe like, a chance again for the left to take back power or take some power in these countries that are just like controlled by capitalism. But, that being said, along with that excitement from the left, there was this huge backlash from the center in the UK, inside the Labour Party. And I mean, there was even backlash in the US to Jeremy Corbyn's rise. So, I mean, before we get to that backlash, which is what your book is about, which is what our conversation is going to really focus on, who is Jeremy Corbyn? For those who don't know, like, why was the center and the right so determined to bring this guy down? What was so threatening about him that was so different than any other person who had been in a leadership position in the Labour Party up until then?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really good questions too. So the other thing that you would always see on those demonstrations is a small contingent of left-wing MPs who were dissenting and were against the war.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, the movement was actually really massive, and actually, even the Liberal Democrat Party, which is this sort of wishy-washy social democrat party um, in Britain, Britain's third party, they were against the war. They were on sort of limited grounds. But anyway, without getting into that whole thing, it was interesting. Some of them were involved, but then you'd get a small, although most of the Labour Party obviously was behind Tony Blair. They started to be dissent. Even within his own, there was one or two shadow cabinet members who started to dissent against that. But what you would always see in the anti-war movement would be a small number of left-wing MPs within the Labour Party who would support the cause against their own party leadership. And of course, it was the Labour government at the time. And you would see that on several different issues, not just the Iraq War, Palestine solidarity movement, support for refugees, and the environmental movement, where the neoliberal Labour Party was against all those things. It was in favour of wars. It didn't take any concrete action on climate change. It was continuing privatisation of public property, which was begun especially under the Margaret Thatcher years of Conservative government. But there was always a small minority of Labour MPs who were socialists and who railed against this, who openly rebelled against the neoliberal leadership of the Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn was always one of these. So he was always a kind of mildly mannered, I suppose you could say, mild mannered MP. He wasn't a kind of for want of a better term, rabble rouser in the best possible way that someone maybe like George Galloway would be perceived as. He wasn't as high profile as George Galloway in terms of media appearances, but he would always be there. So, if, for example, he would be at Palestine Solidarity campaign conferences, and he would be there not only taking part and supporting, but he would be doing the work. Like, he would be doing the work of I remember back in sort of 2011 when I used to be invited to PSC events to speak at them. He would be there and he'd sort of be chairing and taking the minutes, and it would be like he'd be doing the work, but also it'd be the PSC. Any kind of Palestine solidarity work is very attacked, and they would want a kind of almost mainstream's not quite the word, but establishment endorsement that an MP would give them. And there was only a few who were willing to do that, and Jeremy Corbyn was always one of them. So anyone working on a grassroots level in any kind of popular socialist politics in the UK for many, many years would know who Jeremy Corbyn was, which is why the whole left in 2015, when this moment happened, the whole of the British left kind of put aside its ancestral vendettas and united around Jeremy Corbyn.
Which is unusual because, as you
Yeah,
explained, there's like a long history of the left in the UK, like being very sectarian, antagonizing itself, which you could probably say is the history of the left in a lot of places. And there's a lot that goes into that. We don't need to get into that now. But so the Palestine, I mean, the support for Palestine historically is at issue here. He also is like a pretty committed anti-imperialist. He was in a leadership position in the Stop the War coalition, which opposed not just the Iraq War, not just talking the Iraq War and like the Afghanistan war and these sorts of things. We're also talking about the war on Libya, the war on Syria, which, as we know, that can definitely put you in the crosshairs of, like, it's even like these days sometimes it seems like it's even more taboo to talk about those things than it is to talk about Palestine. um
yeah,
Moreover, he also, I mean, one thing he constantly got attacked for was that he wasn't going around calling groups like Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations. He was talking about how they're also political organizations that, like, need to be a part of these peace processes and things like this. So these are the sorts of
Yeah.
things he was constantly being attacked about in the media. And I'm going to quote from your book. When you talk about those media attacks, you mention an investigation by Matt Kennard where he concludes that during Corbyn's leadership, Corbyn was the target of 34 major national media stories openly sourced by former or current officials in the UK's intelligence and military establishment, including MI5 and MI6. The stories all cast him as a danger to British security. So I think that's an important aspect of this too. This guy becomes in charge of the Labour Party, and there is this like sort of like cooperation between different factions of like the security state, the Israeli state, the Israel lobby. At one point, Mike Pompeo even intervenes because they desperately want to make sure that he cannot become the prime minister at all. And so I think that is, that's where we get into where the anti-Semitism smear comes from. But actually, before we get to that, I want a little bit of history here real quick too, because you mentioned this in your book and I like that you do. You also mention, because we're about to talk about a civil war inside the Labour Party, you talk about the past, and you write that in the 1980s, Labour fought a vicious civil war to expel and marginalize the left. And Corbyn was around during that. So this time the civil war and the Labour Party is going to be about anti-Semitism. What was the situation in the 1980s? Like what's the parallel to now?
So the situation in the 1980s there was similarities and there were differences. So the Labour Party was led by a left-wing leader in the early 80s, Michael Foot. And this is soon before the time when Jeremy Corbyn was coming in as an MP for the first time. But throughout those, so there was a kind of internal civil war where Jeremy Corbyn's mentor, Tony Benn, who had been a Labour government minister, but he moved increasingly to the left. He was someone from quite a privileged background, but he moved increasingly towards the left and towards support for working class issues and the trade unions. And he became, by the end of his life, a legend on the Labour left. He died just before Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, well before his campaign took off. He described Corbyn as his favourite MP. And he was someone also involved in those movements I described. I remember seeing him many times speaking at anti-war rallies and speeches and talking against the war and supporting Palestinians. Famously, during one of Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip, I think it might have been 2008-9, cast lead. But there's so many massacres of Gaza, it's hard to keep them all in your mind which one is which. But I think it was cast lead. The BBC refused to air an apolitical fundraiser advert on TV for civilians of the Gaza Strip. It was very apolitical. It was like saying, this is not about the conflict now. It's just about there's children who need aid. And the other channels ran it, but the BBC refused to run it. And Tony Benn famously appeared on the BBC and read out the contact details of where people could send their money for the Disasters Emergency Committee to help the people of Gaza. So, that's the kind of man he was. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when Tony Benn ran for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party to challenge the leadership of the Labour Party, which even before, this is long before the Blair years, but it was kind of sliding to the right or to how, they would perceive the centre because of the challenge from the Conservative Party. And in the late 70s, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, first of all, she won a kind of revolution in her own party for the hard right. Sort of the libertarian hard right, as it were. Mm-hmm. And because of that, there was people on the left and the Labour Party who said, well, look, we can't out-Tory the Tories, so we should become a more left-wing socialist party. And then, there was the leader of the Labour Party in the 80s and 90s was a man called Neil Kinnock, and I mentioned him in the book a little bit. I didn't really have the space to get into the whole history of it, but he was someone who started out on the left and he moved incredibly to the right, and he overhauled the Labour Party in the 80s, and it became this It became this increasingly sort of slick, modern political party, which is fine in itself, but it began to lose all its policies. He began to discard his policies, like he'd once been a member of CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, but he moved towards Labour accepting nuclear weapons and things like that. So this was the atmosphere that Corbyn's political rise, the context to it all, and what happened in the end was Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were actually the proteges of Neil Kinnock. So Neil Kinnock kind of cleared the party, purged a lot of the left from the party. There was a big civil war within the Labour Party to purge what were perceived as Trotskyist elements, and there were Trotskyist elements, and they were purged from the party, and that kind of helped clear the way for Tony Blair for the Labour Party to become just openly neoliberal, and to the point where it was just openly speaking admirably about Margaret Thatcher and her just complete selling off of anything that she could from the country, closing the mines, privatising railways and everything else that she could. So Corbyn managed to remain in the party in these years. And I think Tony Blair liked to have this small, marginalised left within the Labour Party because he could kind of keep them under the thumb. I suppose it was the philosophy of keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yeah.
And because they were marginalised within the party, they were just they were just backbenchers. They were making speeches from the backbench of the Houses of Parliament, and they were going out and campaigning and whatnot. So it was only when Corbyn became a real threat to this right-wing tendency within the Labour Party that he became the leader of the Labour Party that they decided that's got to end now and we're going to have to purge him altogether.
Yeah. And then, of course, Tony Blair ends up gaining and being in charge for a very long time, leads to Blairism and all kinds of horrible things that came to that. He was kind of like a Bill Clinton-esque / Obama-esque figure in the UK in terms of what he was able to do in the kind of neoliberalization and all that. Basically turned the Labour Party into
Tony Blair was very much part of that sort of early 90s so-called third way rhetoric where they said, oh, well, we're not conservatives, we're not socialists, we're a third way.
Yeah, exactly. Which is very similar to what we saw happen with the Democratic Party in many ways throughout the 1990s. And then, so just to bring us back to Corbyn's rise, there's this sort of desperate attempt to figure out, okay, how do we stop this guy from maintaining control of the Labour Party and from ever becoming prime minister? And so you write, the most successful attack vector against Corbyn would prove to be the narrative of a crisis of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. So that's, of course, the crux of what your book is about. And let's start there. Where does that originate? Why do they decide to settle on that line of attack? And of course, what was the role here of the Israel lobby and the Israeli state?
Yeah, those are big questions. So I think there were several factors. Number one was just simply that because Jeremy Corbyn had been in the Palestine solidarity movement for so many years, he had already been attacked in this kind of way. So what I argue in the book, and I think is correct, is that unlike, again, someone like George Galloway or Ken Livingstone, who, they did have national profiles in terms of the mainstream media, Jeremy Corbyn didn't have that so much before he ran for the leadership of the Labour Party. He had to get the members' votes. And so at first, in the first few months, a lot of the mainstream journalists didn't really know who he was.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have their attack lines ready. But the people who did know who he was the Israel lobbyists. So, just this the Israel lobby is, look, when I say Israel lobby, sometimes how that is misportrayed in a bad faith way is this kind of monomaniacal conspiracy of the Israel lobby, capital I, capital L,
right?
That it is there to sort of stamp out everything. That's not really how it works. How it's a sort of diffuse network which works closely with the state of Israel to promote Israel's interests. And there's lots of different groups within that. Most of the time, they work together. And sometimes, they even have internal problems and fight each other, which is always nice to see. They, but they came together to fight Jeremy Corbyn, and because they'd been fighting him for years already before 2015. So I give some examples in the book of how the Jewish Chronicle, for example, which is a very right-wing pro-Israel newspaper in the UK. I mean, for most of your viewers will be US viewers, and so when you think of the Jewish newspapers or Jewish press outlets in the US, they tend to be kind of liberal politics. That's not the case in Britain. Like Britain's Jewish community mostly votes for the Conservative Party.
It's very different. Yeah.
Yeah. So and it's a much smaller community as well. Like I think it's some 300,000 Jews in this country, something like that. And so the Jewish Chronicle, I mean, a lot, 100 years ago, it's an old newspaper, and more than 100 years ago, it was actually an anti-Zionist newspaper. But by the 2000s, it was just this really right-wing, pro-Tory, pro-neoliberal, pro-Israel newspaper, and they've done a really they've done a hit job on my book.
I know. I will. Yeah, I will. Yeah, they have done a hit job on your book. I can even pull that up, but please continue.
Great. I'm quite proud to say. So they, yeah.
And I like look at this photo she uses. Sorry.
That's a photo I posted to Twitter where I was kind of trolling them.
Yeah, there we go.
So I mean, because the Israel lobby is really obsessed with Palestinians, attacking Palestinians and attacking Palestine solidarity supporters as quote unquote anti-Semitic and smearing them in this dishonest way. Just even one MP supporting Palestinians is like the threat of a bad example, and they have to stamp that out. So they'd been attacking Corbyn for years. There was one example where they had one of their columnists. Corbyn had called for an inquiry into how it was that there was a Palestinian leader, Rad Salah, from the 1948 territories. Is a religious and political leader within 1948 Palestine, present-day Israel, who has been persecuted by the Israeli state over the years. And he came on a visit in 2011 to Britain. And long story short, he was basically exonerated and won his legal case because the government wanted to extradite him and all this. Well, he won that legal case. After that, Jeremy Corbyn said he called for an inquiry about how the Home Secretary at the time, the Minister for Internal Security and so forth, which was Theresa May at the time, who later became Prime Minister. Corbyn called for an inquiry of how she'd arrived at that decision because the court case had shown there had been involvement of pro-Israel groups. Now, he didn't call for an investigation of the Israel lobby. He just called for an investigation of how she'd reached her decision. The Jewish Chronicle then reported that as Jeremy Corbyn calls for inquiry into Jewish lobby. Now, he hadn't even called for an inquiry into the Israel lobby, let alone the Jewish lobby, which is, it was a complete distortion. So, and there was lots of stories like this over the years. I remember there was actually one member of a comrade of mine from the International Solidarity Movement back in the day, who happened to be Jewish himself, actually, who was attacked by the Jewish Chronicle, and they claimed that he'd aided so-called suicide bombers in Palestine and all this kind of stuff. It was completely fabricated, and they had to pay him libel damages. So, there's a lot of this kind of stuff they publish. And so because of all that over the years, they already knew who Corbyn was, and they were ready on day one, and they started attacking him before he'd even become leader of the Labour Party. And at first, this didn't have that much effect, but because it's a small newspaper, it's got a very small circulation, right? And it's aimed at a particular, one particular demographic. But it makes up for that by it has a certain degree of influence because it can then because it is a national newspaper, and it is an actual physical newspaper, although it's not read very much anymore. And it does go out into like normal supermarkets and shops, and you can get it with all the other national newspapers. Not everywhere, but in large cities and areas where there's at least some Jewish population, you can probably get a copy of the Jewish Chronicle. So that gives it a certain cachet, like a mainstream credibility. And it meant that like mainstream political journalists picked up on that kind of stuff and they re-reported it themselves, and it was a useful way to attack Corbyn. And then that set a pattern that carried on for until now, really until now. And so Jeremy Corbyn's whole time in the leadership of the Labour Party was really hounded in this way with these false allegations of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and I mean, this didn't obviously just impact during the Corbyn years. It also like you also actually during the Corbyn years you document like how much of a witch hunt it was. You talk about these high profile Corbyn supporters that were literally thrown out of the party.
Mm.
With labor, I'm quoting from you, with labor bureaucrats suspending, expelling, or otherwise pushing out people like you mentioned, Ken Livingstone, Jackie Walker, and then later the left wing MP Chris Williamson, who was viciously targeted by this. And then also something wild that happened too is there was like a deliberate attack. This ended up going into basically blaming this on Muslims, people of color, and then also going after left-wing Jews. So you've just got all these accusations and finger pointing about there's anti-Semitism here, there's anti-Semitism there, and these Jews are a bunch of anti-Semites, and also all these Muslims are, while also actively denying that there's any Islamophobia going on or any racism going on. It almost became like an attack on anti-racist activists. And of course, anti-war activists, and anybody who was just like against Islamophobia was suddenly an anti-Semite. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was really poisonous. It was really, really disgusting. It's really set back a lot of popular movements in this country by years, I would say. I mean, I think, there was a real moment there where the Jeremy Corbyn movement, for want of a better term, had an opportunity to take power, and it came very, very close, as I show in the book, in 2017. But it feels like, I mean, you never know how things are going to go, but it feels like now the British left is really defeated for a generation because it hasn't even faced up to the reality of how defeated it is. It hasn't even faced up to the reality of what happened and how badly it failed to deal with these false allegations. So yeah, it became this kind of weaponized identity politics where, and I give some examples of this in the book, where if anyone was any Jewish person said, well, that's anti-Semitic, it became, to a lot of people in the mainstream, it became, well, it's therefore by definition anti-Semitic. And it didn't matter what their motivations were. It didn't matter it wasn't, there was no evidence of anti-Semitism. It was this kind of sort of weaponized identity politics. And as you say, it often was very divisive because it very deliberately pitted communities against each other. And it became this really poisonous thing of as well of that anti-Semitism is the real racism. That's that's what was being implied a lot by this, especially by this sort of right-wing centrist faction of the Labour Party, where they were saying, oh, well, these far left Trotskyists, they are, they like to claim they're anti-racist, but when it comes to the Jewish state, they hate it. So it was all this kind of stuff where it was, I mean, it was really like the Malcolm X thing of, if you're not careful, the quote about, I forget the exact quote now, but the quote about that what the newspapers will have you hating the people who are against you.
Yes.
hating the people that
Who are the
you should be.
oppressor? Well, have you hating the people who are the like basically the people who are on the right side, and then the victims, and then you are
Yeah,
the oppressor. Yeah.
you know
It's
the one I mean, with
yeah, I
apologies to
know.
Malcolm X. But yeah, it was very much like that. It turned everything upside down. So, like you said, the example, and I've got a whole chapter about this in the book. The left-wing Jews who were supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, because of course there was a lot of them within the Labour Party, within the left of the Labour Party, within these popular movements, within the Labour Party at the popular level, I should say, rather than the hierarchy of the Labour Party or the MPs of the Labour Party, because they'd been Corbyn's comrades for years, and the fact of their Jewishness was neither here nor there. And if it was here, it was the kind of philosophy of never again for anyone in terms of Holocaust, that memorializing and commemorating the Holocaust. That it wasn't a unique. The idea wasn't to make it a kind of unique thing in human history, although every instance in human history has unique features, but that the lessons of the Holocaust should be about for anyone, that this kind of genocide that was carried out against the Jewish people and others during the Holocaust shouldn't be repeated then for anyone. And so they were then, these kinds of left-wing Jews who were pro-Corbyn were systematically marginalized within the mainstream and increasingly within the Labour Party, even during the Corbyn years. And they tried to speak up and they tried to say that anti-Semitism was being weaponized against them. And they were then attacked as anti-Semites. And you had this, or self-hating Jews, or both. And you had this ridiculous situation where you would get non-Jewish Zionists, non-Jewish pro-Israel lobbyists who were attacking Jewish supporters of Corbyn as quote-unquote anti-Semites. So you would have people like Joan Ryan, a Gentile MP who was the leading MP, the director of, or whatever it was, of Labour Friends of Israel, this pro-Israel lobby group within the Labour Party. She was accusing people, Jews who supported Jeremy Corbyn, of being anti-Semites. And it was really, it was all very through the looking glass. And it was really kind of gaslighting on a mass scale, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, by the time Jeremy Corbyn is out, which is like 2019, right? Boris Johnson ends up winning, becoming prime minister. The right has these massive gains, basically because at the end of the day, the Labour Party helped defeat itself. All these attacks on Jeremy Corbyn not only ruined the party, but then you have is it Keir Starmer being appointed to head the party, and of course, this coincides with this massive exodus of some 200,000 people from the Labour Party on top of this purge that took place, which was very targeted, purging of Palestine solidarity activists. I mean, you were even suspended from the party as well. So really changing up the party dynamics completely. And I want to get into some of that as well, but I'm curious, so once Jeremy Corbyn's out, and like you said, this is the left is basically the left in the UK is destroyed for, like you said, a generation. What are the lessons here? Because I mean, obviously there's certain ways and one thing that you've been critical of is you've been critical of how Corbyn, despite the fact that you very much supported him, of how he handled it. Do you believe he made mistakes in how he handled the situation? Do you believe people on the left made mistakes of how he handled the situation? And the reason I ask that is because I think it's very, very important for the left, particularly in the global north, where this accusation using anti-Semitism as a weapon like this is quite common, needs to be prepared to be attacked in the same way. Really, at any time it could happen. It's happened in the U.S., though not in as big a way as it did in the U.K. You could see how it might happen in Europe. It has happened on some small scale levels in some parts of Europe, as well as Canada. So what are the lessons to take from here? What were the mistakes that were made?
Yes, well, I mean, I think it can happen all over the world. It can happen especially in Western Europe and North America, as you say, and the the European and Euro settler countries, essentially, where this kind of thing has become a very powerful political weapon for Israel and its lobby. And Yeah, there were a lot of mistakes made. I mean, I think it's an ongoing issue.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.